Maria had always lived a quiet life, one that seemed invisible to the world around her. Every morning, long before the sun rose, she would wake up in her tiny rented room at the edge of the city. The walls were thin, the roof often leaked during the rainy season, and the old wooden bed creaked with the slightest movement. Still, she never complained. Life had not given her many luxuries, but it had given her strength, the kind of strength that only comes from enduring hardships and still finding the courage to smile. From the age of 15, Maria had been working as a maid to support her widowed mother and younger brother. Their father had passed away suddenly, leaving behind nothing but debts and unfulfilled promises. Maria was too young to understand the weight of responsibility then, but life forced her to grow up quickly. By the time she was 21, she had already worked in several houses, scrubbing floors, polishing silverware, washing clothes, and doing all the tasks others found too lowly to do themselves. Yet, deep inside her, she carried a dream so tender and fragile that she kept it hidden from everyone. That dream was to dance. From childhood, Maria had been fascinated by music. Whenever she heard the sound of violins, guitars, or even street performers playing accordion, her heart would skip a beat. She loved the rhythm, the way music seemed to speak a language without words. When she discovered the tango, fiery, elegant, and passionate, it was as though her soul had found its true expression. She had no teacher, no stage, and no fancy dress to whirl in. Instead, she learned by watching others, sometimes sneaking peeks through windows of dance studios or listening outside ballrooms when she was supposed to be working. She would memorize the steps in her mind, replaying them later when she was alone in her room at night, after long days of labor. When her body ached and her hands were raw from scrubbing, Maria would push aside the small table and practice her tango steps on the rough wooden floor. There was no audience, only the shadows cast by her single candle. Sometimes she tripped, sometimes she got the steps wrong, but she always kept moving, determined to let her heart guide her feet. It was during those moments, in her private little world, that she felt free. She was not just a maid then. She was a dancer, a dreamer, a woman whose spirit could not be caged by circumstance. Still, reality was harsh. By day, she served in the mansion of Edward Grant, a millionaire known for his arrogance as much as his wealth. His home was filled with glittering chandeliers, priceless paintings, and guests who dressed in gowns and tuxedos worth more than Maria could ever earn in a lifetime. Every evening, grand parties were held where laughter and music flowed like wine. Yet Maria was only ever seen as part of the background, an invisible worker carrying trays, serving drinks and cleaning up spills. The wealthy guests often ignored her existence, as if she were just another piece of furniture in the grand halls. Sometimes they whispered cruel comments within her earshot, mocking her simple clothes or the tired look on her face. Maria never answered back. She lowered her eyes, bowed her head, and continued her work. But inside, her heart burned with silent pride. She knew she was worth more than their laughter. She knew that within her lived a fire they could never understand. At times, while she was polishing the floors or arranging fresh flowers on the long tables, Maria would catch a reflection in the shiny surfaces. For a moment, she would imagine herself in a flowing dress, standing tall, ready to dance under the same chandeliers that now only shone above her bent figure. She would picture herself moving gracefully, commanding the attention of the entire room, not as a servant, but as a woman of strength and beauty. The thought always made her chest tighten with both hope and sadness. Her life might have been small, but her dreams were not. The other servants sometimes teased her for the way she tapped her foot while working, as if she always carried a tune inside her. "Maria, you and your dancing feet," one of them laughed once, shaking her head. But Maria only smiled faintly, not daring to reveal how serious she was about it. It was her secret, her escape, her only joy in a life of endless duties. On weekends, when she had a few hours free, Maria would walk to the old park in the city where musicians often played. She would sit on a bench, pretending to just rest, but her eyes never left the couples who danced. Older men and women, young lovers, even children. Everyone seemed to know the steps naturally. She studied their movements carefully, storing every detail in her memory. Sometimes, when no one was looking, She would stand at the edge of the park and try a few steps herself, her heart pounding in both excitement and fear of being seen. Though she had no partner, she would imagine one. She would twirl, pause, and glide as if someone invisible held her hand. In those brief stolen moments, she forgot who she was. She forgot the mansion, the endless chores, and the constant feeling of being looked down upon. She was simply Maria, the girl who loved to dance. At night, when the world was quiet and even the city's noise seemed distant, she would hum softly to herself and move her feet across the wooden floor of her tiny room. Her brother sometimes watched from the bed, smiling sleepily at her determination. "One day, you'll dance for real," he whispered once, before drifting off to sleep. His words stayed with her, echoing in her heart whenever she felt tired or hopeless. Maria had no money, no teacher, and no stage. But she had a dream, and she had the courage to keep it alive. Little did she know, the very place where she was mocked daily would soon become the stage where her hidden talent would shine. Life was quietly preparing her for a moment she could not yet imagine, a moment that would test her courage and change the way everyone saw her, including herself. For now, she remained a quiet maid, carrying trays and sweeping floors. But in her heart, she danced every night, waiting for the day when the world would finally see what she had always known, that even the humblest soul could carry the grace of a queen. The evening of the grand celebration arrived, a night that was meant to showcase Edward Grant's wealth and status. His mansion gleamed like a palace, every corner decorated with crystal lights and fresh flowers imported from faraway lands. Guests from the highest circles of society poured in, businessmen, politicians, artists, and elegant women wearing gowns that sparkled with jewels. The air was heavy with perfume and the sound of laughter, glasses clinking and music from the orchestra that filled the vast ballroom. Maria, as always, worked silently among the crowd, carrying trays of wine and hors d'oeuvres, carefully balancing them as she moved between clusters of wealthy guests. Her plain uniform was crisp but simple, and though she moved with grace, her presence went unnoticed, as if she were just another piece of the background. She kept her eyes lowered most of the time, though her ears caught every word, every comment, every laugh that seemed louder than it needed to be. She had learned long ago that the rich loved to talk about themselves, their travels, their fortunes, and their conquests. Tonight was no different. Men boasted about business deals and new investments, while women spoke of fashion, gossip, and who had recently fallen out of favor in their social circle. Maria, though invisible to them, felt the sting of their arrogance, but she carried on with dignity, reminding herself she was here to work. Edward Grant stood at the center of it all. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the finest black tuxedo, he was a very image of power and privilege. His booming laugh echoed to the hall as he charmed his guests, raising his glass of champagne and tossing clever remarks that made the crowd roar with amusement. Everyone wanted to be close to him, to be part of his circle, for his wealth was not only immense but influential. At one point in the evening, the orchestra began to play a lively piece of tango. The rhythm filled the ballroom, sharp and passionate, making several couples turn to the dance floor. They moved elegantly, men in polished shoes leading their partners with strong steps, women in flowing gowns twirling with grace. The crowd clapped and cheered, enjoying the fiery display. Maria stopped for a moment at the edge of the hall, her tray balanced carefully in her hands. Her heart quickened at the familiar sound of tango. She could almost feel the steps calling to her, whispering to her feet to move along with the music. But she quickly reminded herself of her place. She was a maid, not a guest, not a dancer. Her job was to serve, not to dream. Still, she could not hide the spark in her eyes as she watched the dancers. Her lips moved unconsciously, counting the rhythm under her breath. Uno, dos, tres. The movement of her foot beneath her skirt was small, almost unnoticeable, but her body swayed ever so slightly with the music. It was in that unguarded moment that Edward noticed her. He had been standing nearby, glass in hand, when he caught sight of Maria's subtle movements. Amusement flickered across his face. Here was a maid, daring to feel the music meant for his elite guests. He nudged one of his companions and pointed her out, whispering something that made the man chuckle. Soon, a small group of guests turned to look at Maria, their eyes filled with a kind of curiosity that was never kind. Edward decided to make a spectacle of it. With a sly grin, he raised his voice loud enough for everyone around to hear. "Well, well," he said, his words dripping with mockery. "Look at our little maid swaying to the music. Tell me, Maria, do you think you can dance the tango as well as these fine ladies and gentlemen?" The words made Maria freeze. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment as dozens of eyes turned toward her. She wanted to melt into the floor, to disappear entirely, but she could not move. She clutched her tray tightly, her knuckles white, and kept her gaze down. The laughter around her stung, sharp as knives. Edward wasn't finished. He smirked, clearly enjoying the attention he had drawn. "In fact," he continued, raising his glass higher, "if you can dance a tango as beautifully as you think, I'll marry you on the spot." The room erupted with laughter. Guests clapped and cheered at the audacity of his words. Some whispered cruel comments. Others laughed openly, their eyes full of ridicule. To them, it was nothing more than a joke, a way to entertain themselves at the expense of the maid who had dared to let her heart show. Maria's chest tightened, her heart hammering painfully against her ribs. The humiliation was unbearable. She wanted to run out of the ballroom, to escape the sea of mocking faces, but her feet were rooted to the floor. Tears threatened to rise in her eyes, but she forced them back, refusing to let anyone see her cry. She knew that was exactly what they wanted, to see her break. For a moment, silence fell. All eyes were still on her, waiting to see if she would crumble under the weight of Edward's words. Her tray shook slightly in her trembling hands, but deep inside her, something shifted. A spark of defiance, of pride, rose from the very core of her being. She thought of all the nights she had practiced alone, of all the times she had dreamed of dancing under lights, of all the sacrifices she had made without complaint. Was she going to let them take that away from her? Her mind screamed no. Slowly, she placed a tray down on a nearby table, her hand steady now despite the storm inside her. Straightening her back, Maria lifted her chin for the first time that evening. She looked directly at Edward, her eyes calm yet burning with quiet fire. "Play the music," she said softly, her voice trembling but firm enough to be heard. The room went still. Murmurs spread quickly among the guests. Was she actually accepting his challenge? The very idea seemed absurd to them, and yet the way she stood, tall, proud, unbroken, made some of them pause. Edward blinked in surprise for a moment, then let out a laugh that echoed through the hall. "Well then," he said mockingly, "ladies and gentlemen, it seems our maid wishes to entertain us tonight. Let's see what she can do." He signaled to the orchestra, who hesitated briefly before beginning to play again. The sharp, dramatic notes of the tango filled the ballroom once more. The laughter quieted as anticipation hung in the air. Every guest leaned forward, eager to watch the maid's humiliation unfold. Maria stepped onto the polished floor, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the music at first. But then, as the rhythm wrapped around her, something changed. Her fear melted away, replaced by the familiar pull of the dance she loved. She closed her eyes for a second, inhaled deeply, and let her feet follow the beat she had carried in her soul for years. The mockery still lingered in the air, but Maria no longer heard it. For the first time, she wasn't just a maid. She was a dancer she had always dreamed of being. And though no one knew it yet, this was the moment that would change everything. The hall grew silent as Maria took her first step onto the polished floor. Her shoes were plain, not meant for dancing, but her heart beat with such force that it gave her more courage than the finest dancer's heels ever could. She could feel every eye on her, waiting for her to stumble, waiting for her to embarrass herself, waiting for the joke to end in laughter. But Maria wasn't going to let them win. Not tonight. The orchestra played softly at first, testing the rhythm, the violin drawing out a haunting melody, the bandoneon pressing its aching notes into the air. Maria closed her eyes for a second and breathed in deeply, letting the music wash over her. She remembered the countless nights she had danced alone in her small room, the candlelight flickering against the walls, her bare feet marking the steps on the rough floor. No chandeliers, no gowns, no audience, just her and her dream. Tonight, she told herself, nothing was different. She would dance for herself, not for them. She took another step, then another, her body slowly falling into the rhythm. At first, the crowd chuckled, whispering among themselves. Some smirked, others shook their heads. To them, she was only a maid pretending to belong. But within moments, the laughter began to fade. There was something in the way she moved that silenced their mockery. Her steps were sharp yet graceful, her body bending and swaying as if the music lived inside her. Maria's eyes opened, and they no longer looked down in shame. They were steady, fierce, alive. Each movement carried the weight of her struggles. Every turn told a story of her pain, and every pause revealed her unshakable pride. She danced not just with her feet, but with her soul. Her skirt twirled as she spun, the simple fabric suddenly looking more elegant than any gown in the room. Her arms stretched out with perfect timing, her feet tapping sharply against the floor, echoing the rhythm of her heartbeat. The musicians themselves seemed to play with more passion as they watched her, as though they, too, were caught in the fire of her performance. Whispers spread across the hall, but this time they were not cruel. They were filled with surprise. "She's actually good," someone muttered. "No, more than good. She's remarkable," another whispered back. Edward stood near the center, his smug smile slowly fading. At first, he had expected to laugh along with his guests as Maria fumbled and made a fool of herself. But now, he found himself unable to look away. His eyes followed her every move, his chest tightening with something he could not quite name. Maria's body moved with precision and passion, her every gesture drawing the audience. Her face was serene yet fierce, like a woman who had finally decided to stop hiding. With every step, she seemed to break free from the invisible chains of her station. She was no longer a maid in their eyes. She was an artist, a performer, a woman who commanded respect. As the tango grew faster, her movements grew bolder. She twisted sharply, then stopped on a dime, her foot slicing across the floor with perfect control. Her arms curved around an invisible partner, her head turning with dramatic flair, making the crowd gasp at her confidence. She didn't need a man to lead her. She was leading herself. The chandeliers sparkled above her, reflecting the determination in her eyes. Every spin, every turn, every step was an act of defiance against the humiliation she had endured. She was no longer dancing to survive her pain. She was dancing to prove her worth, to show them all that she was more than the uniform she wore. Slowly, the mocking smiles disappeared from the guests' faces. One by one, they leaned forward, mesmerized by the sight of her. Some clapped softly to the beat, others whispered in awe. The arrogance in the room had been replaced by something else: respect, admiration, even envy. The music swelled, reaching its peak. Maria's movements became faster, sharper, more powerful. Her hair slipped loose from its bun, falling gently around her face, but she didn't stop to fix it. If anything, it made her look freer, wilder, more alive. With each step, she seemed less like a servant and more like a flame burning bright in the middle of the grand hall. The final notes approached. Maria knew it. She felt it in her bones. With a sudden burst of energy, she spun once, twice, 3 times, her skirt fanning out around her. Then she froze in a dramatic pose, her body bent low, her arm extended high, her chest rising and falling with the effort of it all. The orchestra struck the last note, and the hall was plunged into silence. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No laughter, no whispers, no movement. Just silence. Then, slowly at first, a single pair of hands began to clap. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted into thunderous applause. Guests rose from their seats, clapping, cheering, some even whistling in admiration. The room that had once mocked her now bowed to her talent. Maria, still frozen in her final pose, felt tears sting her eyes. But these were not tears of shame or humiliation. They were tears of triumph. She straightened, her chest heaving, and looked around the room. For the first time in her life, she was not invisible. They saw her, truly saw her, and they could not deny what she was capable of. Her gaze shifted to Edward. He stood silent, his glass forgotten in his hand, his eyes fixed on her with an expression she had never seen before. He was no longer laughing. He was speechless. Maria bowed her head slightly, not in submission but in quiet acknowledgment of her victory. She had faced their ridicule, their cruelty, their disbelief, and she had silenced them all, not with words, not with anger, but with the one thing they could never take from her, her dance, her passion, her truth. The applause continued, filling the hall like a storm. Maria stood tall, her shoulders back, her spirit unbroken. She had danced for herself, and in doing so, she had claimed a power greater than anything wealth or status could ever give. That night, the maid who was mocked became the woman no one could forget, and though the evening had begun with laughter at her expense, it ended with admiration that none of them could deny. For a long moment after the music ended, the grand ballroom stood frozen in silence, as though time itself had paused. Maria's chest rose and fell as she tried to steady her breath, her heart still beating wildly from the dance. She had poured every ounce of her soul into those steps, every memory of struggle, every tear, every sacrifice. She stood there trembling, but not from fear anymore. This time, it was from the power of having faced a crowd and not breaking under their scorn. Then the applause began, hesitant at first, like a ripple on still water, but quickly it grew, stronger, louder, until the entire hall shook with it. Men who had laughed minutes earlier now clapped with wide eyes. Women leaned forward in their chairs, whispering to one another with admiration and disbelief. Some even stood, their hands coming together with genuine respect. Maria had done the unthinkable. She had transformed her cruelty into awe. Maria lifted her head slowly and looked across the sea of faces. For the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. They saw her, not as a maid in a simple uniform, but as a woman of fire, grace, and talent. Her body shook with exhaustion, strands of hair falling loose around her flushed face, but her spirit had never been taller. Edward Grant, the man who had mocked her so cruelly, stood motionless near the center of the room. His confident grin was gone, replaced by an expression of stunned disbelief. The glass of champagne in his hand hung forgotten, tilting slightly as though he no longer knew what to do with it. He had thrown out the challenge expecting laughter, expecting humiliation, but instead he had been silenced by the very woman he tried to ridicule. For the first time in his life, Edward felt small. Maria's eyes met his, and though she did not speak, the message in her gaze was clear. She had won. She did not need his approval, nor his promise, nor his wealth. Her worth was not something he could decide. And though her chest tightened with emotion, she did not bow or thank him. She simply stood, unshaken, letting the power of her victory speak for itself. The guests noticed Edward's silence. Some glanced at him curiously, others whispered behind their hands, wondering how he would respond. He had made a spectacle of her, but now the spectacle had turned back on him. The man who commanded every room he walked into had been humbled by the very maid he once considered beneath him. The orchestra members set down their instruments slowly, their eyes still fixed on Maria. They had played for countless dancers in their careers, but rarely had they seen such raw emotion, such untrained but pure passion. One of the violinists whispered to another, "She was born to dance." The other nodded silently, unable to take his eyes off her. Maria felt the weight of all those stares, but for once they did not burn with shame. Instead, they warmed her, feeding the small flame of pride she carried inside. Yet beneath that pride was also exhaustion. Her body ached from the intensity of performance, but her heart was light. She had done what she never thought possible. She had shown them her true self. The applause began to fade as the guests waited for Edward's reaction. Some expected him to laugh it off. Others thought he might turn the moment into another cruel joke. But Edward didn't laugh. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. For the first time, words failed him. He finally managed a stiff nod, but his voice betrayed him when he said, "That was unexpected." The words were weak, hollow compared to his usual commanding tone. Guests exchanged glances, some smirking at his discomfort. He had wanted to humiliate Maria, but now he was the one exposed. Maria did not flinch at his words. She gave him one last steady look, then turned her eyes away. It was not his approval she sought, and she did not need his empty acknowledgement. The hall belonged to her now, if only for that moment. The power had shifted. a woman from the crowd suddenly called out, "Bravo!" Her voice was clear, full of genuine admiration, and soon others joined in, their claps growing stronger again. Several guests rose to their feet, giving Maria a standing ovation. Some clapped with joy, others with guilt, realizing they had judged her too quickly. The energy in the room shifted entirely, and where there had once been arrogance, there was now respect. Maria felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wanted to remain strong, to show them that this was not weakness. It was victory. She pressed her hand against her chest, breathing deeply, and allowed herself a small smile. For the first time in years, she felt free. In the back of the hall, one of the older guests leaned toward his wife and whispered, "That girl has talent. Real talent. She shouldn't be serving food. She should be on stage." His wife nodded, her eyes still fixed on Maria with admiration. Maria heard none of these words, but she didn't need to. The look in their eyes told her everything. She had changed the way they saw her forever. Edward, however, struggled with the change. He prided himself on control, on always being the one who dictated the tone of the room. But tonight, that control had slipped through his fingers. He had underestimated Maria, and now he was left with nothing but the sting of his own arrogance. He finally set his glass down with a sharp clink, trying to regain his composure. "Well," he said louder, forcing a smile, "it seems our maid has hidden talents." Who would have thought? But his attempt at charm fell flat. The applause that followed Maria's performance had drowned his authority. People no longer laughed at his words. They only looked at him with thin smiles, their admiration clearly directed toward her. Maria stood quietly, absorbing the moment. She did not answer him, did not acknowledge his attempt to reclaim attention. Instead, she bowed slightly toward the musicians, a gesture of gratitude for their music, and then stepped back from the dance floor. The guests moved aside for her as she passed, their eyes following her every step. No one mocked her now. No one whispered insults. Instead, they looked at her with something she had never known from them before: respect. Her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together, but she held her head high. Inside, her heart was bursting. She thought of her mother and brother, of the long nights she had practiced alone, of the tears she had shed in silence. All of it had led to this moment. She had proved to herself, and to the world, that her dream was real. As she disappeared quietly into the crowd of servants waiting near the side of the hall, the applause still echoed in her ears. She didn't need a crown, a gown, or a fortune. Tonight, she had something far greater: dignity. And though Edward tried to smile and carry on the party as though nothing had changed, everyone in the room knew the truth. The maid had won, and the millionaire had been silenced. The thunder of applause still echoed in Maria's ears long after she stepped away from the polished dance floor. Her heart beat heavily, not from fear now, but from the overwhelming weight of what had just happened. For the first time in her life, she had stood in front of people who had always seen her as less than human, and she had shown them something they could not deny. She had silenced their mockery with nothing but her courage and the dance that had lived in her heart since childhood. She stood near the tall doors of the ballroom, breathing deeply, her hands trembling as she tried to calm herself. Her uniform clung to her skin with sweat, and her hair was falling loose around her face, but she didn't care. Tonight, she was not just a servant. Tonight, she was more. She felt it in her soul, and she could see it in the eyes of everyone around her. The guests still buzzed with excitement, their voices rising and falling as they discussed the unbelievable scene they had just witnessed. "I've never seen anything like it," someone said, shaking his head. "That girl has fire in her veins." Another replied, "She dances better than half the performers I've seen on stage." Who would have thought? A maid! Their voices were no longer filled with scorn, but with respect and amazement. Edward Grant, however, remained silent. He stood with his glass untouched, his smile tight, his face pale. For the first time in his life, the attention in the room was not his. He had been the king of every party, the center of every conversation, the man everyone wanted to impress. But tonight, his throne had been taken from him by the very girl he had tried to humiliate. He could not laugh his way out of it. He could not buy back their admiration. The silence that fell on him was louder than any applause. Maria, though exhausted, felt stronger with every passing moment. She had not danced for him, nor for the guests, but for herself, for every night she had practiced in secret, for every tear she had swallowed in silence, for every time life had told her she was nothing. She had proved them wrong. She had proved herself right. One of the older women approached her carefully, her gown glittering with diamonds. Maria braced herself, expecting another cruel remark, but the woman's eyes were kind. "My dear," she said softly, "you are magnificent." She placed a hand gently on Maria's arm. "Have you ever thought of performing? You have a gift." Maria's lips parted in shock. For a moment, she couldn't answer. She simply nodded, her throat too tight with emotion. Others soon followed, offering word of praise she had never dreamed of hearing. Some asked her where she had learned. Others shook their heads in disbelief when she told them she had taught herself. "No teacher," one man exclaimed. "Then you are a genius, young lady. Pure genius." The murmurs spread quickly, turning into a wave of admiration that even Edward could not stop. His attempt to humiliate her had backfired in the worst way possible. The more they praised her, the more invisible he felt. For once, the great millionaire had nothing to say. Maria bowed her head politely to the guests, though inside her heart swelled with pride. Yet she knew she had to leave the floor before the weight of the moment crushed her. Quietly, she slipped away toward the back of the hall, where the other servants stood watching with wide eyes. They looked at her as though she were no longer one of them, as though she had stepped into a different world entirely. But Maria only smiled faintly and whispered, "It's still me." Her closest friend among the servants, a young girl named Clara, grabbed her hands with tears in her eyes. "Maria, you are brilliant. I've never seen anything like it. You made them all silent." Maria laughed softly, though her voice shook. "I just did what I always dreamed of doing." But she knew deep inside that this was more than just a dance. This was a turning point. Her life, as humble as it had always been, would never be the same again. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. The music continued. The guests returned to their conversations. But something had shifted in the air. Maria's dance had left a mark on them, one they would not easily forget. When the last of the guests had gone, the mansion grew quiet again. The chandeliers dimmed, the music ceased, and the servants began to clear the tables and tidy the rooms. Maria walked slowly through the empty hall, her footsteps echoing against the marble floor. She paused for a moment where she had danced, the space now silent and still. Closing her eyes, she let herself relive the moment. The music, the applause, the feeling of freedom that had filled her chest. It was real. It had truly happened. As she stood there, Edward entered the hall. His steps were heavy, his expression unreadable. For a long time, he said nothing, simply staring at her. Maria met his gaze calmly, refusing to look away. Finally, he spoke, his voice lower than usual. "You surprised me tonight." Maria tilted her head slightly, her voice steady. "I didn't dance for you." Edward flinched at the sharpness of her words. He opened his mouth, perhaps to defend himself, perhaps to make another remark, but no words came. He simply nodded stiffly, turned on his heel, and walked away, leaving Maria standing in the middle of the empty hall. For the first time, he had nothing to add, no way to regain control, and that silence was louder than anything he could have said. When Maria finally returned to her small room that night, her body ached with exhaustion, but her spirit soared. Her brother sat up eagerly as she entered, his eyes wide with curiosity. "How was it?" he asked. "Did you dance?" Maria smiled, tears finally spilling down her cheeks as she pulled him into an embrace. "Yes," she whispered. "I danced." And they listened. In the days that followed, the story of the maid who silenced the millionaire spread quietly among the city's elite. Some laughed about the irony. Others spoke with genuine admiration. But all agreed on one thing. Maria was unforgettable. Opportunities soon began to appear. Doors she never thought would open. Invitations to dance, offers of training, even whispers of performances. The very people who had once ignored her now wanted her on their stages. And while Maria accepted with humility, she never forgot the lesson of that night. That respect earned through courage was worth more than any riches offered without dignity. She continued to work, to support her family, but now she walked with her head held high. No longer invisible, no longer just a maid. She was Maria, the girl who danced a tango so fiercely that she silenced a room full of laughter. And though Edward Grant tried to bury the memory, he could never escape it. For the rest of his life, whenever he thought of that night, he remembered the fire in her eyes, the strength in her steps, and the silence that followed when he realized he had been defeated. Not by another millionaire, not by power, but by the courage of a maid who refused to bow. That was her true victory. Not applause, not praise, not even the opportunities that followed. Her greatest triumph was knowing she had silenced every doubt, every insult, every cruel laugh. With one dance, she had turned humiliation into triumph. And no one, not even Edward, could take that away from her.